The Submerged State, explained. What is the submerged state? Let's start by asking what it is not. It is not a conspiratorial notion of high-ranking government officials and agencies with immense amount of power like the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, taking over and secretly manipulating the government. What it is, however, is an evolving way of looking at the American welfare policy design process and implementation process. To give you a more holistic vision of what the submerged state looks like, I'll break it down across three axes. The first, what kinds of policies are considered submerged, and why do policymakers design them this way? Second, who do submerged policies benefit, and who do they hurt? Third, why are these policies significant to the conventional notion of American democracy? But quickly, before I jump into this topic, I just want to explain who I am and why I'm doing this. It was Professor Suzanne Mettler who came up with the idea of the submerged state and published a book called The Submerged State: How Invisible Government Policies Undermine American Democracy in 2011. She came and lectured to my class at Cornell University on her book. I was inspired to make this topic known so that we the people can avoid the unintended consequences of deteriorating civil engagement because of unintentionally uninformed notions of how the government works. Odds are the government could be working for you without your even knowing. The big question I want you to keep in mind while I'm explaining the submerged state is the government's role visible when looking at the design? Jumping into a popular way Obama's administration tried to explain submerged policies is, quote, spending through the tax code. Spending by the government, especially when it comes from a Democratic leader, can sound counterproductive to how you think the government should operate. But is it really spending? Effectively, yes, for the government, but technically no for the denizen. There's two ways the government can spend. First, by doing it directly, creating programs like SNAPs, also known as food stamps, through mandatory and discretionary spending, as well as paying off interest on debt. The second way they can spend, however, is by lowering their revenue by creating tax breaks and subsidizing loans and industries, effectively giving money back to individual actors. What the government is doing with these submerged policies is changing tax code to create tax breaks for having healthcare insurance, having children, owning a home, being a senior citizen, for needing student loans. Suzanne Mettler writes, the mechanisms or tools through which such activities occur have proliferated to include a great variety, such as loans subsidized and guaranteed by government, but offered through private banks and government-sponsored enterprises, social benefits in the form of tax incentives and tax breaks for those engaging in activities that government wishes to reward. How the government should spend is one of the most controversial issues right now in this era of hyperpartisanship. So, let me flag my biases ahead of time. I lean left of center because I have seen empirical evidence of the good that direct spending by the government can have. Just look at student loans. The only way that they have reasonable interest rates is because the federal government was willing to assume the risk of the private lenders, of the banks. Last important characteristic of the submerged policies of all these social programs is that they exist on a spectrum from most visible to most submerged, with government benefits being redeemable through private actors, like food stamps being used at Aldi instead of just at a government food pantry. Now that I've given you an idea of what submerged policies look like, I want to give you an idea of why the submerged state has grown so rapidly, especially since 1981. There are four main reasons why. The first is that Republicans and conservative Democrats found them very attractive because they don't increase the size of the federal bureaucracy. It was an approach to spending dubbed, quote, starve the beast. Cut spending by cutting revenue. It was also thought to deter other direct government spending programs because you're getting rid of the funds to start them up in the first place. The second reason the submerged state grew so rapidly was because other Democrats were willing to go along. Because technically it still was welfare spending, even though it didn't come in the package of a direct program. The third reason why is that institutional features of Congress make it easier to enact tax code changes or tax exemptions than it is to create new direct spending programs. The fourth reason why is that they have cultivated the support of interest groups that defend them vigorously. Take the mortgage interest deduction, for example. It gives realtors an extra tool to work with when trying to sell homes, and so is a great benefit to their business. The act of governing requires making choices about who will benefit and who will not from policies. Obviously, this leads to a lot of debate over who should benefit and what item do they receive as a benefit. This is why scholars like Theda Skocpol have argued that universal policies, those that benefit the most people, are not only the most politically popular, but also the most effective at benefiting disadvantaged groups within the population. The same politics are at play in the submerged state, and in part because of the interest group support I mentioned earlier, submerged policies end up fostering economic inequality. Let's turn back to the example of the Home Mortgage Interest Tax Reduction, HMID for short, to show this reality at work. Here is a graphic from Mettler showing the winners and losers of this tax reduction. And while it's not a zero-sum game for those receiving the least benefits, the amount that those with the privilege to already have an annual household income of $100,000, the amount that they benefit from this tax reduction is disproportionate from the rest. Mettler writes, quote, "Moreover, both the HMID and other benefits from homeowners operate as artificial incentives that encourage people to purchase more expensive and larger homes than they would in their absence. As a result, such policies inflate prices, making home ownership more out of reach for non-owners. For those who are financially capable of buying a home, housing equity provides their primary source of wealth, and that further widens the economic gap between owners and renters. In addition, the lost government revenues leave lawmakers with insufficient funds to maintain or create policies that could more effectively enhance the social welfare of low and moderate income citizens." This case of the wealthy disproportionately benefiting from submerged policies is not unique to the HMID. The submerged state has also promoted entire sectors of the economy over others, especially healthcare with major programs like Medicaid and Medicare. Here, highlighted in blue, are the submerged policies, representing indirect government social spending, that a majority of respondents have used without realizing the government's instrumental role in designing and implementing them. This brings me back to the big question I asked at the beginning of part 1. Is the government's role visible in the design? It seems the answer is no for the largest social, in air quotes, spending policies, which raises Mettler's main question. Do invisible government policies undermine American democracy? The evidence, sadly, seems to suggest that yes, submerged policies do undermine American democracy in a number of ways. One way they do so is by lacking citizens' approval. Not only are some citizens unaware that submerged policies exist, but, as we saw, a majority of the beneficiaries of these policies don't even know that they're receiving government benefits. Mettler articulates this concern by writing, quote, "We lack understanding of whether citizens support or oppose such policies, or, at a more basic level, whether they are aware of their existence and are thus able to form meaningful opinions about them. To the extent that such policies lack citizens' consent or approval, they may represent a fundamentally undemocratic development. We do not know how benefiting from them shapes citizens' view of government, of its legitimacy, or of their obligations towards it. Neither do we know whether they prompt or discourage civic engagement, enabling citizens to mobilize and express their views to their representatives in the political system." Another way submerged policies undermine democracy is by eroding trust in the government. Mettler writes, quote, "When government is invisible, it is no surprise that people feel they cannot trust it and that it is ineffective. Submerged policies also have the potential to decrease political participation." Mettler writes, quote, "Scholars have found that some direct and invisible policies have the potential to enhance individuals' interest in politics, their sense that government is responsive to people like them, and their disposition to become involved. One clear example of this is the black beneficiaries of the GI Bill after World War II, who were funded by the government to get an education, which they then used in the fight for civil rights. Lastly, submerged policies and the submerged state work to maintain the economic status quo, keeping the wealthy as the strongest voice in politics. So, there it is, the submerged state explained. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope, no matter your political leaning, that you learned something new about the politics of American public policy.